Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to our discussion on Manifest Destiny in the Antebellum Era. Now, before we get started, it's important to understand what Manifest Destiny means. Breaking it down, manifest means obvious or to make happen, I guess you could say. And destiny is future. One's future. So manifest destiny, if put into that context, is obvious future. Now, going back to the colonial era, at the onset of the Declaration of Independence, if you recall from our discussion on the Revolution, John Adams actually wrote his wife a letter basically saying that July 2nd would be celebrated from one end of the continent to the other, which is an extreme foreshadowing of the eventual concept of expanding the country from sea to shining sea and it being America's God-given right to do so. So in the 1840s, westward expansion had led Americans to acquire all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific in that movement that we now call Manifest Destiny. And Americans began to flood into those western territories for economic opportunities and to get away from certain issues in the East. For example, the Mormons move west to escape religious persecution. And by the 1840s, the U.S. had gained Texas, Oregon, California, and several other territories through either war or treaty. And changes in the early time period, so 1800 to 1840, really encouraged the westward expansion that we see in the 1840s. So going back, way back to the beginning, from 1607 to 1783, Americans are confined to those original 13 colonies. The western border of the colonies was the Appalachian Mountains, and colonists were forbidden to settle past those. They had tried prior to the French and Indian War, but after that's over, the British force any colonists that are living west of the Appalachians to move back to the east. And it's forbidden until 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. With the Treaty of Paris, we gain all of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. That's our, I guess you could say, prize for winning the Revolution. Britain agrees to give us that land. So now we've got it basically double our land mass. When Jefferson comes into office in 1800, by 1803, he purchases the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. This essentially, again, doubles the size of the United States. And after he purchases the Louisiana Territory, he sends Lewis and Clark out on this great expedition trying to find waterways that will get us to the Pacific Ocean. They don't find that, but they do find immense economic potential in the Western Territory. Farmland, natural resources, and they really make a concrete manifest that the Louisiana Purchase will be a great thing for the United States. In the 1800s, we really see the rise of King Cotton and commercial farming, and this, in conjunction with the Louisiana Purchase, really encourages more and more Americans to want to move west because there's more land, it's less populated, and they can plant more crops and therefore make more profit. So the economic pull is there for the Western lands. With the improved transportation that we see with the first industrial revolution, we see improved canals, we see the invention of steamboats, increased railroads throughout the eastern territories, the eastern states. This increases the speed and profitability, especially because majority of these railroads are in the northern regions of the United States, which, while not an industrial sector until the second industrial revolution or the Gilded Age, it's much more industrial than the South. And so the advent of these new transportation modes allows for increased profit as well, because you can not only sell more goods, but you can sell them quicker. By 1840, we end up doubling the size or doubling the number of states that we have in the Union. From 1790 to 1840, we get Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, Missouri, and Arkansas, and Michigan. So we go from 13 states and we double that to 26. Not only do we double our states, but we also see a huge population boom in the western states. So, for example, in 1790, our most populous states are Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and New York. All of those are part of the original 13 colonies. By 1840, Pennsylvania and New York are still there. Virginia is still there. But we also get Ohio and Tennessee, which at that point are considered Western territories. Even though in our modern mindset, they're still kind of Eastern. At that point, they're very much part of the Western frontier. So U.S. population growth alone, not meaning in any particular state, as a whole, in 1790, we have under 5 million people in our country. By 1840, we're upwards of 17, 18 million people. And so we almost quadruple our population from 1790 to 1840. And part of that is just new births. A large portion of it is also immigration. A lot of people are coming from Western Europe, Ireland. During that time period, we see the Great Potato Famine, which is a known push factor for the Irish to leave Ireland and emigrate to the United States. So the population in general booms between the 1790s and the 1840s. And the journey west at this point is very dangerous. It's very unpredictable. But yet thousands of Americans believe that it's necessary, and they travel along the Oregon, Santa Fe, and Mormon trails in search of new homes and new economic opportunity. Many of these people lose their lives or end up having to settle somewhere other than where they had anticipated. They're taking this journey in covered wagon or on foot. And it's through territory that's still very unknown, especially once you get to the Rocky Mountains. This is the less traveled, less known portion of the United States. And so not only are you coming into contact with Native Americans if you go in the wrong time frame, you might get stuck in the Rocky Mountains during the winter time, which is what happened to the Donner Party. And in that story, they turn to cannibalism because they have no food and they're desperate. The earliest pioneers are fur traders, land speculators, and just poor farmers who are looking for cheap land that they think is going to help them to get back on their feet. Soon we get more farmers and miners, ranchers, and then the religious groups such as the Mormons. And they're flooding into these territories especially for the miners, it's for natural resources, gold, silver, iron. Farmers and ranchers are looking for more open land for their crops and their cattle. But in general, all of these people are very courageous to get up, move, leave their home, leave the only place they've ever known, to travel hundreds of miles through uncharted territory and just basically start over is extremely courageous, especially in this time period. The Oregon Trail led thousands of farmers to fertile lands of Oregon in the 1840s. And at this point, we're still seeing this as a very British territory because there's still a dispute on whether it's American territory or American territory. And we start to see the settlement of many Americans here because of opportunities for farmland. The Santa Fe Trail is used predominantly to sell U.S. goods to Mexico because it does go into modern-day Texas and New Mexico, where Americans would sell their wares to the Mexicans and make a profit from it. And then after Joseph Smith's murder in Illinois, Joseph Smith had been a prophet of the Mormon faith, and he was murdered, I believe, for his religious beliefs. Brigham Young decided that Illinois may not be the right place for them. And so he takes young Mormons through treacherous territory, following the Oregon Trail for the most part, to find a new place for them to be, a place that they can escape the religious persecution and make a home for themselves and their faith. And they do this in what is modern-day Utah in the Salt Lake City area. And then westward expansion not only brings prosperity and economic opportunity, but it brings conflict with Native Americans. Because as we know, for things like the Indian Removal Act in the Jackson administration, many Native Americans were pushed off of their land by the white man and forced into reservations in the Western territories before America stretched into those Western territories. So as more and more white Americans are moving westward, they're angering many of these Native Americans because they're like, you already pushed us off of our land once. Where are we going to go if you continue to do this? So Native Americans such as the Blackhawks and the Black Hawk War disrupt the day-to-day life of these Native Americans. And it leads to things like the Black Hawk War, where the Black Hawk Indians feel as though white Americans are disrupting upon their hunting grounds and violating treaties between the Native Americans and the federal government. The Treaty of Fort Laramie actually creates a vast Indian territory in what is now modern day like Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. But it's repeatedly ignored by these white men that are moving west. And it's more of a Native Americans weren't considered people. Most Americans at this point see them as savages. And so they feel as though, because of, unfortunately, what would now be considered white privilege, they go in and take over these lands that don't belong to them. And it ends up leading to a series of wars with the Native Americans all the way up into the 1860s and 70s. By the 1840s, America had realized its manifest destiny. Either by war or by treaty, Americans had taken over the entire continent from sea to shining sea, just as John Adams had predicted. In 1845, the U.S. annexes the independent nation of Texas. We're going to get into that here in a few minutes. In 1846, they settle a land dispute with England to gain Oregon. And then in 1848, the U.S. gains the new land in the Southwest by winning the Mexican-American War. So let's go in and take a look at these separate entities and how they manifested. In 1821, Mexico wins independence from Spain, and the new Mexican government begins to welcome Americans into the Texas territory by offering them cheap land. So it's a way for the Mexican government to get a little bit of money and allow for Americans to come settle in their territory. Because they know Americans are wanting to move west, so why not make a little money off of it? Stephen F. Austin becomes one of the wealthiest Anglos in Texas because he buys up a lot of land and then starts selling it. He's kind of a land speculator of sorts. And in order for Americans to move to Mexico, they have to agree to some terms. They have to convert to Catholicism. They have to learn Spanish. They have to leave their slaves behind. And they are guests in the country. They don't get representation in government. Now, we know how that's going to work out. Americans don't like the whole no representation in government. And so Americans refuse to accept these laws placed on them by the Mexican government. If they weren't already Catholic, they're not converting. They're going to bring their slaves with them because that's part of their livelihood, and in America, it's okay. So these are my property, and I'm bringing them with me. I don't necessarily need to learn Spanish because, well, I'm still American. And if I'm going to live here, I want a voice in government. This very clearly is not going to make the Mexican government very happy. And so in 1834, Mexican President Santa Anna begins to view the Anglos as a threat and has Stephen F. Austin arrested because he feels as though Austin is kind of being a rebel rouser and stirring up trouble. And a lot of people see him as a very charismatic person and a leader to the Texans. And so in 1835, Texans were in open rebellion against the Mexican government. And this is going to lead to the War for Texas Independence. And so this spans from 1835 to 1836. And it is fought along what is now modern day South Texas, predominantly in like the San Antonio, Houston type of area. And we fight the Battle of the Alamo, very famously lose. But even though we lost, it becomes a rallying cry and an inspiration to the Texans. And in every succeeding battle, it's remember the Alamo is the inspiration to keep fighting and keep moving. And Texans led by Sam Houston end up capturing Santa Anna and winning their independence in 1836. And so in 1836, Texas becomes an independent nation. From 1836 to 1845, Texas is its own country. Sam Houston becomes the first president of the Republic of Texas, and he In 1838, Houston actually invites the United States to annex Texas. Annex means to bring into, because Texas it's not very stable. The economy is quite bad, and they really cannot continue for much longer. So Houston makes the offer to the federal government, and the debate over slavery keeps the Congress from adding Texas as a state. Because at this point, if you add a slave state, you have to add a free state to keep the lines even. And one of the biggest issues with Mexico and Texas is the Americans didn't want to give up their slaves. So if they're going to come into the United States, they're not going to want to give up their slaves either. So they would have to be entered as a slave state, and in turn they would have to enter a free state as well. And the government really didn't have one of those just lying around at this point. In 1844, Democrat James K. Polk wins the election, and he becomes the first manifest destiny president. And he becomes known as that moving forward. And he really urges Congress to go ahead and make Texas the 28th state in 1845. And he does this because he wants to also bring Oregon in. Because he wants to end the British claims in Oregon. And so he thinks that if he does this, he can bring Texas in as a slave state and Oregon in as free state. So when Texas is admitted into the Union in 1845, it is admitted as a slave state. To make the Northerners happy, again, Polk wants Oregon as a free state. But the U.S. and Britain compromise, and they divide Oregon along the 48th parallel. Oregon became a free territory in 1846. And so if you look at our map here, essentially Oregon becomes its own territory. And it does not actually get admitted as a state. And Oregon residents and President Polk demand the entire Oregon territory. 54-40 or fight is their rallying cry. Because essentially half of the territory would be British and half of the territory would be American. And that 49th parallel is going to separate the two. But the people who are living in this territory are like, no, we want to be American. This is stupid. And so the 54-40 is the entire territory between the 54th latitude and 54 degrees 40 minutes and south. And so it essentially means the entire Oregon territory gets to become part of America. So when Texas wins its independence from Mexico in 1836, the two sides disagree over the territory borders, the two sides being Texas and Mexico. When the U.S. annexes Texas 9 years later, they're still fighting. They're still trying to decide which side gets what land. The dispute led to the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, because now it's not just the Republic of Texas that's fighting, it's the United States. And the U.S. isn't going to settle for just a little bit of land. So in 1846, President Polk sends General Zachary Taylor across the Rio Grande River and provokes Mexicans to go to war. It lasts a couple of years, and eventually the United States wins the war. And some foreshadowing for our next major conflict, which is going to be the Civil War, many of the officers that are predominant in the Mexican-American War will also be predominant in the Civil War. So the Mexican-American War ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And under this treaty, the U.S. gains all of Texas to the Rio Grande River. And the Rio Grande River now becomes not only a natural border, but a political border between Texas and Mexico. Mexico also ceded or gave up territory in the Southwest. We call this the MexicanSession. And it's essentially modern day New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. So it's a huge section of territory that's just given to us because it's in the treaty. And in order to end a war, you must have a treaty. And that's put in the treaty. So not only does the United States gain all of the rest of the Texas territory, but they also gain half of the rest of the country. 5 years later, the U.S. buys the Gadsden Purchase for $10 million. And the Gadsden Purchase is that very bottom section of modern-day New Mexico and Arizona. And we buy this to build the Southern Railroad. So now we have all of the entire continent that we have in a modern day. In the 1830s, Mexico offers cheap land to American ranchers and farmers to start moving to California. So not only are they trying to offer this to Texans, or people to move to Texas, they're doing it for California also. When the Mexican War breaks out in 1846, though, Californians revolt from Mexican rule and create their own independent nation. And so California at one point was also the California Republic. Just like Texas was the Republic of Texas, California is the same way. They were an independent nation. But it's annexed by the U.S. as part of the MexicanSession in 1848. So they are only independent for a couple of years. The discovery of gold in San Francisco leads to a flood of Americans to California in 1849. The 49ers, as they're called, which is also why the football team is called the 49ers, rushed to California hoping to strike it rich. And most of these people are coming from eastern territories of the United States, eastern states rather. But they're coming from Latin America, they're coming from Europe, they're coming from Asia. Word gets out about the gold and everybody comes. Gold fever and immigration to California was a national phenomenon. And anybody who wants to prove their bona fides are going to go to California and they're going to try to strike it rich and prove to everybody that they can do it. By the end of the 1840s, the U.S. had achieved its manifest destiny. We'd become a continental empire. From Atlantic to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea. Westward expansion stimulates the economy, the spread of democracy, and increases that sense of U.S. nationalism or patriotism. But as America spreads west, we start to see even more sectional issues over slavery arise. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next discussion. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great day.